Welcome to the Justified Posteriors podcast, the podcast that updates beliefs about the economics of AI and technology. I'm Seth Benzel, with nearly half of my total output constituting software development and writing tasks, coming to you from Chapman University in sunny Southern California.
And I'm Andre Fratkin, enjoying playing around with Claude 3.7, coming to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Okay, so Andre, what's the last thing you used AI for?
The last thing I used AI for? Well, it's a great question, Seth, because I was so
I know
excited
AI gave it to me.
I know that I was so excited about the new Anthropic model that I decided to run it by asking it to write a referee report about the paper we are discussing today.
Incredible. It's pretty meta, I would say, given the topic of the paper. Maybe we can hold in our back pockets the results of that experiment for later. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we want it to be a mystery about how Claude reviewed the work of its creators.
Claude reviewing the work of its creators. Can Frankenstein's monster judge Frankenstein? Truly. So, Andre, maybe we've bounced around this a little bit, but why don't you tell me what the name of today's paper is?
So the name of the paper is a bit of a mouthful. Which economic tasks are performed with AI? Evidence from millions of Claude conversations. But a more easy to explain kind of task that this paper is doing is it's introducing the Anthropic Economic Index, which is a measure of how people use the Claude chatbot, and is using it is kind of like demonstrating how it can be useful in a variety of interesting ways for thinking about what people are using AI for.
Right. So at a high level, what this paper is it's just trying to document what are people using Claude for. I also was perplexed about the fact that they also referred to this paper as an AI index, given that an index usually means like a number, and it's unclear what is the one number they want you to take away from this analysis. But that doesn't mean that they don't give you a lot of interesting numbers over the course of their analysis of how are people using Claude? What are they using Claude for?
Yeah. So before we kind of get into the paper a bit more, let's talk a little bit about the narrow and the broad claims and kind of what are our priors. So I think kind of the narrow claim is maybe what specifically are people using Claude for? Do we think that this is a representative description of the actual truth? And kind of the authors of this paper kind of divide up the analysis in many different ways, but maybe one way to think about it is like, is it true that the primary uses of this chatbot are computer and mathematical tasks? And is it also true that actually relatively few people use the chatbot for office and administrative support, as well as managerial decision-making?
Right. And I think those are excellent questions. The first question is, what are people using Claude for right now and large language models for right now? Do we buy that the way that they're kind of analyzing the usage data gives us an answer to that question? Before I answer the question of whether I think that Claude's approach in analyzing their own chats is appropriate, let me just tell you kind of like what my sense coming in was, right? So if you had said, Seth, what are people using chatbots for right now? I would have guessed, number one, they're using it for doing their homework instead of actually learning the material. And number two, actual computer programmers are using it to kind of speed up their coding, right? It can be a great coding assistant in speeding up little details. It was not a category that was analyzed by Claude, but they do say that nearly half of the tasks that they see people using these AI bots for are either some form of coding and software development or some form of writing. And of course, writing could be associated with tasks in lots of different industries, and they'll try to divide that up. But on its face, if you told me that half of what people use chatbots for is writing help and coding help, if anything, I would have thought that that's on the low side. To me, that sounds like 80% of use cases.
Interesting. So I guess, where do I come on that prior? I think I'd say I'm with you. I think we probably agree on our priors. I'd say that most of the tasks I would expect to be done with the chatbot might be writing and programming related. I think there's a caveat here, which is there's a set of behaviors kind of using chatbots for entertainment's sake that I don't know how, you know, frequent that is, but I don't know if I would put it into writing or something else. But I do know that there is a portion of the user base that just really likes talking to Claude. And I don't know where that would be represented in this data set.
Yeah, maybe we'll revisit this question when we get to limitations, but I think one of the limitations of this work is they're trying to fit every possible usage of AI into this government list of tasks that are done in the economy. But like, I don't know about you, Andre, but I've been using AI for things that aren't my job all the time. And it's like, it's unclear that when America came up with this quote unquote ONET database of tasks people do for their jobs, I don't think they ever pretended for this to be a list of every task done by everyone in America. It was supposed to be like a subset of tasks that seem to be economically useful or important parts of jobs that are themselves common occupations, right? So there are some limitations to this taxonomical approach right from the start. But I guess I know coming back to your object point, which is like when people are playing around with chatbots instead of using them from work, what are they doing? My friends, so I have a cousin, love this guy. Alex, if you're listening, we love you. But his favorite thing to do with chatbots is to get them to write slightly naughty stories. And then he kind of giggles. Oh, the chatbot said that the bad thing happened. You're not supposed to say that. And he finds this so amusing, right? Presumably that's going to show up in their data as some kind of creative writing task, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that's a little bit of a limitation here. So I guess if we're now, so moving from the question of like object level, what do we think people are using chatbots for? I think we share this intuition that it's going to be overwhelmingly coding and writing. But now we go to this next question you have, which is to what extent can we just look at people have with chatbots and translate the kind of the number of those conversations or what sort of things they talk about in those conversations into a measure of how people are going to usefully be integrating AI into the economy. There seems to be a little bit of a step there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and to be clear, I mean, I don't think the authors actually make the claim that this is kind of a map of where the impact is going to be. I think they mostly just allude to the fact that this is a really, you know, useful system for kind of real time tracking what the models are being used for. I don't think the authors would likely claim that this is a sign of what's to come necessarily, but it's still an interesting question, right? So what do you think, Seth?
I guess I hear that, but they right on the face they call it the Anthropic Economic Index, right? If you wanted to call it the Anthropic, what are people using Anthropic for right now, snapshot, or the Anthropic Usage Index, I'm a lot more sympathetic to. I think they have to do a lot less work defending that idea than the Anthropic Economic Index.
Ooh, this is maybe where the academic and corporate lingo collide, right? I mean, but yeah, I hear you. I mean, in the sense that, you know, it's not clear that what is being done in these chats is necessarily economic activity versus, you know, personal activity, learning activity, and so on and so forth. And, you know, maybe a more humble naming of the index could have appeased some of the, you know, the critical version of the Anthropic referee definitely brought up this point, is what I'd say.
Yo, you got to be on the defensive when you come up on the Justified Posteriors podcast because we challenge you to justify your posterior. So you better be ready to defend yourself. All right. So okay. So narrow question. I gave you my prior. It's going to be overwhelmingly used for coding and people doing homework assignments. And then like I guess homework assignments is going to look like mostly creative writing and in regular writing and history writing and all of the different things people do homework assignments for. So we'll see what the data actually says. And the broad question, I guess I would say this is a great view of what people are using Claude for right now. But to try to translate that into economic value or what people are going to use Claude for in the future, giant grains of salt here. I think it's better than random guessing, but I think there's a huge gap between the things people will use AI to play around with as a tool or for fun or to explore versus where are people getting consistent economic value from it.
Yeah, I would say the same. I view this as a proof of concept
Mm,
and something that has like very natural extensions that can
mm,
make it much more useful. And, to be clear, I think, it was probably a large effort just getting everything in shape for this sort of analysis. And, I doubt that this is the end all be all of the work that the team is doing there. But I'd also agree that I think we need a lot more work to convince us that this is kind of giving us a general shape of what the LLMs are going to be used for. I mean, in particular, I mean, we'll get to this in the limitations is that a lot of work moves to the API, right? So a lot of the activity that is done for work is not actually captured by this index because business users use the API. There's also a business plan where the usage from the business plan is not included in the index. So I can imagine why these were not included, but kind of limit it does limit our ability to understand economic impact.
right. Okay. So, on that note, having laid out our priors, Andre, do you feel like you've laid yours out in sufficient detail to confront the new evidence that Claude is putting before us?
Yes, yes. So let's kind of get to, well, what does the paper do? What do the authors do? I think at a very high level, what they do is they come up with a method for categorizing conversations as being mapped to tasks. And then they map those tasks to a database that's kind of been used all over economic research of the tasks, how tasks correspond to jobs. And by doing kind of that crosswalk, they're able to say something about what jobs have, many tasks that are already being done by the chatbot versus what jobs do not have those. And then in addition to that, they think about, when people are having these conversations, are they kind of automating a task or are they more like collaborating with the AI to do a task? So that's kind of the
Right.
high level thing that they do in this paper. And then
I
it's
think it
kind
would
of a
be
measurement
maybe
exercise.
yeah, maybe we can they actually give some really useful examples of conversations which are matched to tasks and then occupations. So maybe I can give one or two. So for example, they consider the user conversation. The user posts, "My game keeps crashing as I only have 8 gigabytes of RAM." That's the post that the user puts into Claude. That is then classified by their automatic categorization as the ONET task modify software to improve performance and adapt to new hardware, which is then mapped to a specific computer and mathematical occupation. Similarly, they give the example of a blog post. Can you make sure this blog post follows Chicago style? That's associated with the task standardize materials from other writers and staff, which is considered associated with an arts and media job. The first thing I want to point out is that all of these conversations sound like hobby activities rather than actually creating economic output. So, like, on its face, it's not clear that they're actually saying things about people doing their jobs. Secondly, the guy whose video game keeps crashing because he only has 8 gigabytes of RAM is clearly not like a computer programmer. It's clearly a guy who's just playing a video game. I just want to say that, like, the examples that they give of this classification task does not inspire confidence that they are measuring people's work activities.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they do some, I'd say, better examples when they're thinking about automated behaviors and augmentative behaviors, like format this technical document in Markdown, or here's my Python script for data analysis. It's giving an index error. Can you help fix it? That seems like more work related stuff, although, of course, the Python error thing could easily be, one of my students asking for help with a homework assignment. But those are kind of plausibly more work related, yes. But I guess what do you make of that, Seth? that those were the examples.
What I make of this is that I kind of feel like they should not that the title of this paper, "Which Economic Tasks Are Performed with AI?" This paper should just be "Which Tasks Are Performed with AI?" Right?
Mm,
It's not
mhm.
it's not clear that anybody what makes a task economic? In my opinion, the thing that makes a task economic is it's like it's gotta be at least one of 2. It's either gotta be some sort of like Robinson Crusoe economy, and even if I'm not interacting with anyone, this is an economic behavior because I'm building a thing that I'm going to use that's gonna, I'm playing Minecraft with myself and I'm building up something. Or like what makes something economic is that I'm participating in a market with this thing and I'm gonna buy it and sell it after I go through these steps, right? And my video game is crashing because I only have 8 gigabytes of RAM. Doesn't sound like either of those. It sounds like this guy is troubleshooting his, like, consumption, which I don't know, maybe that's like you could think of it as the consumer taking on some of the job of the customer service, so maybe that should be a customer service job. The other example we gave, can you make sure this blog post follows Chicago style? If I'm making an artistic or creative project that I'm just putting out on the internet for people, again, I'm not sure I would call that economic activity. So again, I have no problems with this paper being a paper about measuring what activities or what tasks people do with AI, but I think it's probably a bridge too far to call these economic tasks.
Yeah, yeah. I think I agree with you. There needs to be more metadata around these conversations. I think a survey of like, where are you using this for your job or not, of the users could be really informative here, right? Or, even just a subset of the analysis to just the pro users who are more likely to be using this for their job. I think both of those would kind of help us think through these a bit more. I do think it's an interesting phenomenon of substituting for professional labor with personal labor. Hal Varian used to bring this example up all the time with YouTube. Like before you'd hire someone to like repair your appliance or do some work around the house.
Mhm,
But now you can watch a YouTube video and do it yourself, right? And
mhm.
and Hal would be talking about how this kind of means that YouTube is generating all this tremendous economic value that's not being kind of measured well. And I do think, let's not throw away that argument. I think both of us are
Right.
generally on board with that, GDP is going to miss a bunch of interesting activity just by virtue of how it's being measured. But it's still kind of, especially for an academic contribution, right? We want a more rigorous analysis, if that makes sense.
Or just be clear what your domain of analysis is, right? Because if you're gonna take the stance that anything anybody does is economic, well, then again, just call it tasks. You don't have to call it economic tasks if every task is an economic
Right.
task. What makes these economic tasks, I guess, is the main critique. But what I will say, okay, but in this paper's favor, they do look at 4 million fricking conversations on Claude, the world's second leading, LLM. So there's a sense in which even if what they're not measuring is exactly economic usage, this is a very, very important cross section of usage.
Yeah, I mean, and it's important for a lot of stakeholders, right? It's important for policymakers who are obviously thinking about what LMs are being used for. It's important for businesses thinking about, what are consumers' kind of needs that they can service with these models, right? It's obviously important for Anthropic itself to understand its user base. The new model that they released today is very focused on computer programming tasks in a way that other competitor models are not. And I think that must be informed by the fact that their users like really value this use case and they're going to kind of meet their customers' needs rather than just trying to push a model that's kind of very, very smart, generically so, but maybe isn't, catered to the use cases of the user base.
Dude, you said like 3 really interesting things right there. Okay. The first super interesting thing is like, to the extent that these models are not perfect substitutes for each other, we would expect them to develop specializations, right? And so, yeah, one important limitation of this study is Maybe Claude just turned out into being the coding specialized LLM or the writing specialized LLM, and that's what we're picking up. So I don't think like we're that deep the tech tree at this point where like the models are that different for that to be a giant consideration. But you can imagine that being a bigger consideration as we get 4 or 5 more years down the line. The second thing you pointed out is just like this question of to what extent are these model builders able to direct like what task they get better at. And I know this is way beyond the scope of our conversation today, but something I really want us to talk about in a future episode is to what extent do we think that AI development is directable in the sense of, oh, I'm going to make an AI that's really good at coding and you're going to make an AI that's really good at writing. To what extent are those separate tasks versus, no, you just make a better AI and, maybe there's like a little bit of an intangible asset in making it in a shell that's useful for coders, but that's basically trivial.
Yeah, I mean, wow, that is a really, really big question. I mean, I tend to be, I come from the world of thinking about personalized rankers, right? That's kind of
Mm.
in my dissertation, I thought about personalization, right?
If I recall, your
And
dissertation was about ranking people from best to worst, right?
I would never rank
I'm
people,
not. I'm
Seth.
kidding. I'm kidding.
Come on, you know, only by objective metrics.
Thank you. Thank you. It was science.
No, but I, more seriously, right? Like a lesson from digital technologies has been that personalized rankers, personalized recommendations, experiences really increase the utility of users, right? Like
Mm.
make users use the product more. They create more value for the user. It's also true with personalized advertising. And I think it would be a little weird to then have this generic model that's not in any way catered to the users, right? And so far, we haven't really seen a lot of catering to users. We've seen kind of big models and maybe system prompts, but not a lot of talk about maybe, well, what if you tweak the final layer to give a certain type of answer that this certain type of person wants? That's kind of
Right.
been left to, specific application developers, right? So, Harvey maybe, developing the lawyer version of ChatGPT. And so they're going to do some fine tuning on their end to kind of cater it.
Right.
But to the extent that like there's an interface that people are generically using, you would expect the designers of the model for that interface to think really hard about what their users want.
Right. Yeah. So there's like two questions there, which is not just is it directable, but to the extent that there is a non-directable component, what is the ratio of investment in the non-directable component to the custom, occupation wrapper or the custom task wrapper that like adds a little bit more, but maybe not fundamentally. Anyway, great question for a future episode. Yeah, so okay, 4 million of these conversations. They basically get the AI to label all of the example conversations as assigned to one of these tasks that are then assigned to occupations. Similarly, they classify each of these 4 million conversations by whether they're more automate-y versus augment-y. I guess one thing I want to say here before we get into the findings is the amount of human validation of these automatic ratings seems a little bit limited. So they talk about in their appendix that they validate 150 examples of the what occupation is associated with every conversation and 86% agreement between their
Mhm.
human 150 hand coders and the AI labeler. I don't know, not terrible, not great. How do you feel about the automatic labeling here? And just like basically, really, they have 4 million observations. They only checked 150. It seems like a little low.
Yeah, I mean, I guess and this is where my prior comes in. I know my prior is that this can do a pretty good job. Obviously, if I was the referee, I might push them a bit more on this. It's not that expensive to check the conversations. I guess what they would tell you is that they actually really care about privacy preserving methods. And so maybe they didn't feel comfortable having kind of external raters do the checking of the data, right? So
Mhm.
I think if one of the interesting emphases of this paper is how they're really worried about privacy concerns. And if we think about it, that actually makes a lot of sense. Why
Mhm.
does it make a lot of sense? Because
Mm.
people talk to these chatbots about very personal issues, very
Mm.
personal, related
Stuff
to
that
their
you wouldn't talk
health,
about at work.
stuff that you wouldn't, there's even studies that suggest that you would tell chatbots things that you wouldn't tell your therapist, right? Like, so
"Hey, chatbot, if I tell my therapist I wanna murder someone, do they have to report on me?"
yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. But anyway, so I think
We have finally invented a use case for ChatGPT. Okay, keep going.
and remember, I guess, like, what are the reasons that Facebook got such a bad reputation? Because they were doing some of these academic studies and they kind of turned out in ways that were creepy to the public,
Mhm.
fairly or not fairly. In some cases, I think unfairly, but they got negative press. And so this emphasis on privacy seems very prudent for a chatbot provider,
So
but maybe
highly
it limits what they can
non-interventional.
do. Yeah.
Right, yeah, it's also non-interventional, which limits them a lot too, right? It's just purely descriptive. But, we like descriptive stuff, don't we, Andre?
Yes. 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 This is what our
Ok
profession under provides.
Yes, good.
Alright, so maybe we can start running through the specific findings now.
All
So,
right.
their first main result, I would say, is what occupational groups use Claude, and then as a proportion to their representation in the US economy. So they find that the most common use of Claude is for computer and mathematical conversations. They think 37% of conversations are computer and mathematical. In my brain, that's some combination of coding help and tech troubleshooting. But when you think about it, only 3.4% of the US workforce is involved in computer and mathematical occupations. So that's a giant overrepresentation of those tasks in their data. Meanwhile, something like office and administrative support, which is 12% of American workers, they see as only constituting 8% of their conversational tasks. So a slight underrepresentation of office work, which you would think would be at least somewhat susceptible to automation. What do they not see any usage of AI at all? Very little usage for farming, fishing, and forestry. Not a surprise, very physical. Like physical and social science, 6% usage. People are asking questions about that, maybe a slight overrepresentation compared to the US economy. A very low usage of for legal services. A little surprised about that. I've definitely asked my Claude some legal questions. I don't know what jumps out at you from figure three, Andre.
Yeah. I mean, I think the office and administrative support is a fascinating one because it's so low when obviously so
Mm,
much of the work can be automated.
that way to us.
Yeah. I mean, just filling out forms, creating forms, various compliance tasks. I wouldn't be surprised if the current generation of models is already better than the vast majority of the humans doing that job. And certainly when they do it together, that, they should do a better job. So I think this really speaks to this issue that I think we talked about before on this podcast, which is diffusion and barriers to adoption, right? Imagine you're an office worker, you know, not a senior manager or anything like that, and you have a bunch of tasks to do about expense reports and so on. You might be hesitant or actually just disallowed from using LLM to do this type of work. For
Right.
example, my mom works in a hospital. She's not, an an administrative support worker or anything, but she tells me that there's kind of a lot of restrictions about the use of LLMs within the hospital, and that might be for legal reasons or even perceived legal reasons. Maybe there aren't actually any laws being broken by using it within the context of a hospital, but the management might be conservative in a variety of ways, right?
Right.
And so, even though this is a very useful thing for this, it is not being done. So, I would say, like, both of us have this strong prior, right, that office and administrative support work has to be automated by LLMs, right?
If it should help us with anything.
Yeah. And I think the
Uh,
legal services thing is quite similar, right? And actually raises kind of another question about this index. And it's one of my hobby horses, I guess, is
Mm,
the number of times you use the LLM for something is not indicative of the value of the usage, right?
Oh shit, here we go. The number you're telling me I wrote 1,000 lines of code. Might not have produced as much value as someone who wrote 2 lines of code.
Yeah, yeah. Like as the cost goes down, you might start using these things for very trivial things. That's kind of one version of this, even if they're not very high value. The other version of this is, hey, like that one medical question I asked Claude might have saved my life. And the value of that is much greater than every other
Wait,
interaction
you
I've
can't,
had
you
with
can't,
Claude.
you can't, wait. You can't drop that in the conversation without giving context to people who have missed
No,
the context for that.
no. I mean, there's
Okay.
no context for that. Not like I think it would save my life, but I've actually used it, to help me diagnose any, my own issues, or for example, to interpret a medical result. Maybe that's not well advised or whatever, but I have used it for that, and it's given me peace of mind and various
Mm,
other things that I found very useful. That value, I think, is probably greater than the value it might have provided for me and other things that I use it more frequently for, like to
right.
write referee reports for the papers that I referee. And just to be clear, I write my own reports, but I do like to check my reasoning with Anthropic. That's something I do use. I just for the editors out there.
Yeah. No, come on, guys. I don't know. Maybe Andre, you want them to send you less papers to review. It's up to you. What message you want to send? All right. All right. So now we're going to start moving into some results from the paper that I find much less convincing.
All
So,
right.
moving into a result I find much less convincing, the authors of the paper argue that they can measure between occupations what percentage of tasks do people use AI for at least a little bit or at least at all. You might ask, the listeners at home, you might ask, for a data set with 4 million conversations, what does at all mean? Well, it means that they they need to find at least 15 observations of someone having a conversation on this topic in order to count it as
Mhm.
this is a task that appears in the data. Why 15? Who knows? Maybe it has some esoteric properties that they find desirable. But, you know, I guess what I'm trying so let's me read the results on its face. They say that 36% of occupations have at least 25% of their tasks. People are looking for help for those tasks with AI. And for about 4% of occupations, people are asking for help with about 75% of the tasks associated with that occupation. So in that 75% range, I'm assuming these are like programming and math jobs and that big in that computer and mathematical section. Now, why am I a little bit sus of why do I cap this, as the children say, Andre? Well, the reason is that we already heard they only double checked 150 of these classifications. Of those 150 classifications, they have an 86% correct classification rate. So you're telling me that 14% of their classifications are wrong, and they've got 4 million of them, and they only want to see 15 of it happening in order for it to count as happening? I don't know, Andre. There seems to be some like low end stuff going on here that I am not sent on board with.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, once again, this is like I agree with you. It could be that a lot of these low end things are really just misclassifications. You'd want to change that threshold, right? You'd want to vary it, to 100
Or
or 1,000.
I could maybe add one thing, which is it's not necessarily just misclassification.
Yes, yeah,
This is supposed to be a paper about economic value creation. The fact that like I tried a thing 2 times and it never worked
yeah,
and then I stopped using it, like, yeah, you can
yes.
get up to 15 use cases from people experimenting and realizing it doesn't work.
Yeah, well, okay. This is kind of goes back to, one of the big questions I have for that. It's like,
Right.
wait a minute, guys. Where's the indicator of success? Where is the success button at the end of that? I know you collect the likes and the not likes, but right. So there's a
Mhm.
sense in which, at least using this methodology, we don't know whether someone actually accomplished what they were seeking to accomplish with their interaction with the chatbot.
Right. So I'm not sure how much we learned from this analysis above what we already heard. The next, I guess maybe the final or the penultimate result we should cover is instead of looking at occupations, they look at different skills that seem to be called for in these Claude conversations. And the things that are at the top of the list are pretty intuitive for me. They list critical thinking, active listening, reading comprehension, and writing and programming as basically the 5 or 6 top usage skills that are called for when people call Claude. Those all make sense to me. But the stuff on the bottom here, I find pretty surprising. They find that almost none of the records relate to repairing or operation and control. I find that a little bit surprising. I know YouTube is probably a better source overall for repair advice. I don't know. It seems like a natural place to get help from chatbots from. And then the next set that I'm very surprised to see so lowly ranked are things like management of financial resources, time management, management of personnel, monitoring, selection. So these are all managerial jobs. And other than judgment and decision making, which ranks sort of reasonably high up, most of these managerial tasks are really not called for in Claude, which I would ask people to not sleep on, because we have been seeing employment growth in managerial occupations. There's some sense in which some sort of managerial or entrepreneurship tasks sort of have to be the scarce complement to AI. So it is very striking to see the lack of managerial talent called for in these Claude queries.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great observation. I think it raises a lot of interesting hypotheses that it would be nice to investigate. Before I just mentioned those managerial tasks, I do think that the number one task, which is critical thinking, is of course a managerial task, right? It is cognitive labor, and hopefully managers are critically thinking.
Well, yeah,
But
hopefully they're critically thinking. Hopefully they're active listening. I mean, and there's some sense in which
yes,
being
yeah,
calls for every task, right?
yes. So, but looking at these things, like let's start with repair. I mean, what do I think is going on here? I mean, you don't have to repair things that often, right? So this is kind of, I think the right question might be like conditional on having to repair something. How often do you use an LLM, right? And if that could be 100%, and it would still be a tiny portion of all the usage because you just don't need to repair things that often.
Well, it's not my job.
Negotiation is kind of similar. I mean, I don't know, when was the last time I negotiated something? I mean,
It's stressful, dude. Negotiating is
yeah,
stressful.
it is stressful. So I think that's kind of one of the things. It's just kind of what are the base rates? That's a really important thing to consider here. I think the other thing, and this is a point that Tyler Cohen makes a lot, is that, well, like the people who will learn to use the AIs will be most successful. Like maybe the AIs are already very good at some of these tasks, right? Like active learning, management of personnel resources, but people don't view them as AI tasks. And maybe that's because there isn't like such a close feedback loop as there is with programming. And as a result, they're just not going to the AIs for advice. They're somehow not doing it that often. And that might be kind of like a growth opportunity or place where a lot of value could be generated just in diffusion friction.
Right. If you could figure out a way to overcome people's frictions, or if you built a wrapper in some way that made using it more intuitive for those tasks, maybe that's a big entrepreneurship avenue. If you get a unicorn startup based on that idea, please send your checks to Justified Posteriors all right, we'll come back. We'll edit in the exact address of the Bitcoin wallet you should send your shares to. Are there any other results you wanted to cover before we start talking about our posteriors?
I mean, I guess the augmentative versus automative.
Oh yeah, about this. Would you buy this at all? What do you think of this? So maybe you can tell us the 5 different kind of tasks that they classify conversations into.
Yeah, so they're classified as kind of directive tasks, like complete this task with minimal interaction. There was a feedback loop, like debugging this piece of code. You put in a bug. It gives you this potential solution. You try it, and then you come back to it. You have task iteration, which seems a lot like a feedback loop to me, but it's a collaborative refinement process. I love the word refinement, by the way, for all the Severance fans out there. I'm glad we're refining over here.
Yeah, wait, is that I take it that that's a euphemism for something very ugly?
No, we don't actually know what refining does.
I take it it's not good, but keep going.
Yeah, learning, knowledge acquisition and understanding. And then there's validation. I've already written this thing, and you check it. to suggest any improvements. And they kind of say that the directive and feedback loops are automative and augmentative are kind of task iteration, learning, and validation. And then they kind of say kind of what percentage of conversations are of each type. So for example, they say about 15% are feedback loop automation and about 28% are directive automation. And then on the augmentative behaviors, they say that kind of there's a lot of task iteration and learning going on. Yeah.
All
So,
right.
so what do you think of that, Seth?
Well, have to tell you, Andre, I love the idea of like looking at what is the style of the conversation. Is it the feedback loop? Is it validation? I think that that's super kosher. I'd love to see these results. I am not surprised, but it's interesting to see that the majority is for the task iteration at 31%. And validation is pretty rare at 3%. So like maybe on its face, some of these results aren't so surprising. The part that I object to here really deeply is calling one of these sets automation while calling the other set augmentation, right? You know, I've been studying robots taking our jobs for over a decade now, Andre. And you know what? As far as I can tell, there is not a good definition for automation. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is when people talk about automation, what they usually mean is a technological change that reduces the attractiveness of jobs, that reduces demand for labor, or at least that's what I think it should mean, right? If you said, here's my automation technology, it's increasing demand for labor. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't sound very automated to me. It sounds like you need more labor.
Well, conditional on type, right,
Right.
Seth? So, you have a technology, it reduces demand for a certain type of labor, but there might be some complementary labor types that the demand increases for. One might say that that's automative of one occupation and not of the other,
Now,
right?
now explain the absurdities that this gets you into, right?
Yeah.
So my favorite example of how something that looks automated at the micro level actually is augmentative at the macro level comes from the US experience of slavery. There's also a fun example here with ATMs, but that one's less interesting,
Yeah.
so I'm not going to tell that one. So back in the olden days when America was growing cotton, with slave labor, it was very, very time intensive to take the seeds out of the cotton, right? And so cotton was sort of a crop. People used it for some kinds of clothing. It was like in the mix. But then a technology came around called Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which basically automated the incredibly labor intensive process of taking the seeds out of the cotton that was harvested, right? So we're going from a super labor intensive job, 100% labor job, to now a 99% capital job. Does this demand reduce demand for slaves in the American South? No, it leads to an explosion in demand for slaves in the American South because American cotton is now able to outcompete European wool and European linen, right? There's like a micro sense in which the cotton gin automates the task of taking the seeds out of the cotton, but there's a macro sense in which speeding up cotton production really dramatically increases demand for people making cotton, right? If you were going to say anybody was automated, you'd say it was like the sheep herders that got their wool replaced with cotton. They were the people who, if anybody got automated. And anyway, so I find the way that people talk about automation very loosely here frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you, Seth. I do think that there's a little bit of a difference between, occupation. I think it makes a little more sense at an occupation level rather than a task level, right? So the slaves in your example, but I guess we can also think about the bank tellers and the ATM example. Their job consisted of a mix of tasks. And then some of those tasks became very cheap to do automatically, but the other tasks remained, right? So I guess kind of to steelman kind of a version of automation is that if every task that a person in a particular occupation, if every task got automated, they might find work in other occupations, but it's not like it's necessarily obvious that it's going to be kind of the same worker benefits from increases in demand in other parts of the economy caused by this technological change, right? So you might think like undifferentiated labor is this example that kind of, yes, of course, undifferentiated labor is going to be able to do any type of labor where demand has increased that doesn't require an education or whatever. But
Mhm.
I'm not sure that that's kind of like representative, if that makes sense.
Right. So on its face, if you told me, hey, look, this job that you used to do, your productivity has gone up by 10x. Like, am I anticipating doing as many hours of that job as I did before? No, probably there's complementarities across different tasks. Probably if you make me way, way, way more productive because you automated some subset of my tasks, I'll probably do less of the unautomated tasks as well, right? I'll probably definitely do less of the automated tasks. But that's a partial equilibrium analysis, and even if it's rare, it is certainly more than conceptually possible for the general equilibrium effects to, increase
Yes,
demand for my occupation or my remaining tasks.
of course, of course.
Okay, so my takeaway here is, people use AIs for a mix of things. Some of them look a little bit more like one-shot interactions. Some of them look a little bit more like iterative interactions. Some of them look like the human is bringing a little bit more of their own thinking. Maybe that's the way to think about it, is that 57% of these tasks, the user is bringing some of their more thinking and some of their own creativity. That's not, I wouldn't call that augmentation versus automation, but I do think there is a distinction here, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I don't even know if I like what you just said, Seth. I mean, like complete, the example of the directive task is format this technical documentation in Markdown, but someone
Yeah,
presumably wrote that technical documentation, right? That
right.
someone is probably the user, right? So
So
not
that's
necessarily,
including
of course.
creativity, right? Yeah, exactly. So there's
Yeah,
some
yeah,
sense in which
yeah,
we even the coming up with the prompt is the worker's work in the automated task.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, but I do think this is, really valuable descriptive work about how people are using the tools, right? And to the
Mhm.
extent that that's changing over time, that's telling us something. So an important concept in these systems is like human in the loop. Like at what point do you not need the human in the loop? And
Mhm.
so if there's a way to see kind of, oh, like the chatbot one shots this task, with very high probability, that's interesting. Now, once again, what I'd want here is a success metric. I really want a
Right.
success metric. Did the interaction succeed in generating a result that was valuable, correct, etc., to the user? And without that, it's just really hard to interpret this.
Right. So maybe this is a natural place for us to transition into limitations. So we've
Yeah.
already kind of listed a few. One limitation here is amount of time spent talking about something is not exactly proportional to economic value. Lord knows I spent a lot of time talking about the New York Jets, but it's not helping the Jets succeed at all. Another limitation that I pointed out is it's not clear that everything everyone uses AI for is a work task, which introduces both problems in terms of their only classification schema is work tasks. So if somebody's using AI for not work, it's gonna do something weird, I guess. And also just based on the fact that if you can't distinguish between what's the experimenting versus what's the in production operations, it's hard to really connect this to economic value. What do you see as the biggest limitations?
Yeah, I mean, you already said that for the most part. I guess, yeah. In addition to what you've said, yeah, I'm fascinated by this model specialization thing. Yeah, are people going to Claude for coding and going to Grok for shit posting? I
Hey,
don't know.
oh man, I'm sure Elon Musk said to his staff, we need the AI that's best at meme posting. I'm
Yes,
sure
yes,
that conversation happened. They list in terms of their limitations, they talk about the fact that the model classification might be imperfect. I do think that that's an issue. I know you don't worry about it so much.
I do worry
There
about it for the minor tasks. To be clear, I
right,
I,
right.
I
For
mean,
the
I
real
think
task.
I
Yeah, I agree. I
for
think
the
I'm with you.
yeah, I don't think they're like getting programming wrong that much on average. I mean,
I think
not
that's exactly
it's not
right.
a difficult task.
But for
Can
the
I
rare
also
shit, please.
Yeah. So can I also now say what Claude said in its
Yes,
referee report?
here we go. This is perfect timing. What did Claude say about its own paper?
So I first asked it kind of a generic prompt to write an economics referee report, and it kind of gave concerns as external validity, task complexities, how does it distinguish from professional and novice level inquiries, dynamic considerations, the ONET framework limits these. Point four is causal interpretation. Readers might draw causal inferences about AI's impact on the labor market, and the author should more explicitly describe the limitations of drawing such conclusions. But that's kind, Claude. Now I said, be real.
Never too.
Then I said, be real. If this was a real economics, referee report, there would be additional concerns. So major concerns. One, fundamental identification issues. The paper fundamentally fails to establish that it is measuring what it claims to measure. And it goes on. Two is absence of a theoretical framework. I don't really blame them for this one. I mean, you can't put in you shouldn't put in theory into a paper just because there's theory about the topic. Selection bias and external validity because of just having Claude users. Yeah, we've already talked about this. I mean, I think it's
Not
a
super
limitation,
interested,
but it's
yeah.
not like it's still interesting.
Not a
even
killer.
though.
Agreed.
Yeah, endogeneity concerns. That's an interesting way to put it.
What are they worried is endogenous?
So Claude is worried that Claude's capabilities in different domains may lead people to use Claude in different ways, that Anthropic's marketing and positioning of Claude may lead people to use Claude in different ways, that the user interface design favors certain interactions, and that temporal factors, including Claude's release timing relative to competitors, may also affect these patterns. That's a great...
Sounds like it's fine, but it's representativeness again.
Yes. And I mean, actually, this is kind of a nice thing about iterating with a model is like, that actually brings up the point. Like, how do the usage patterns change when they've just released a new model? Are we seeing a fundamental change in the usage patterns? Are we seeing mostly more of the same? Is it like a slow drift? Is it a sharp discontinuity? There's so many questions to answer with this type of data,
Truly.
I think. Yeah. But not necessarily economic.
Well, I was going to say the fact they call it an economic index suggests that we're going to get updates. So I'm excited for that.
Yeah. Yes. I think that is kind of just the over time series, I think is very interesting of this.
So that's funny. So is it fair to say that Claude did not hit upon what I see as the biggest limitation here, which is kind of the assumption that this is all economic activity when a lot of it probably isn't?
No, that's its number one point. I mean, it calls it a fundamental identification issue. So the mapping from a person asked Claude about X to AIs being used to perform economic task X involves unsubstantiated leaps in logic that undermine the entire analysis. That is Claude. Calm down, buddy.
That's reviewer too, dude.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I feel like if they just left economic out of the title, that would defeat that objection pretty heavily.
Seth, there's a paper we haven't discussed on this podcast yet, which is the paper of friend of the pod, Daniel Rock.
Friend of the pod
on task exposure. And we'll probably devote a separate episode to this, but I do wonder, how do you compare this paper to that?
That's fascinating. So that's a paper about what the AI thinks it can do. Whereas this is a paper about what are people actually using AI for. Now, if I recall, Dan's paper does have an extension. We're talking about the paper GPTs are GPTs, Elendau et al. 2023.
Correct.
Out in Science. That paper does have some sort of validation. I forget if it was from a survey or from something used on Stack Overflow, but they did have some sort of, is there a correlation between what we think people should use this for and what they actually use it for? That was very positive. So I guess I like that sort of mixed methods approach of here's what we think that they should be able to use it for. Here's what they are using it for. How else would I compare these two papers? Yeah, they're kind of doing different things. One's a descriptive paper about one now. One's sort of a possibilities paper about, taking this task at its face. Do we think it's conceptually automatable by these kinds of systems? So I view them as complementary.
Yeah, I think I'm with you there. Obviously, measurement issues are paramount, but one thing one could think about is kind of a gap, a measure of the gap between the potential capabilities from Ellen Dow and all and the realized usage from
Right,
here, right?
right, right, and you measure that wedge and you give it a fun name. You call it the Fradkin wedge. And it's like a measure of the size of the administrative and legal frictions in that domain.
I mean, it would be interesting to have it.
But yeah, but that's where this is going. And I think the next steps for this sort of very zoomed out literature are one, connecting what people actually use it for to these measures of what we think it should be good at. And then two, the thing that you keep on coming back to is an economic success measure of, did this succeed? Am I happy with it? Did it do the job? Because as we keep on talking about, you can talk about a thing a lot without getting any work done.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so maybe let's move on to our posterior.
Yes, our posteriors. So I would say that I came into reading this paper thinking that people use AI for first coding and second for cheating on their homework. Nothing I have seen in this paper contradicts that prior. I guess the biggest update for me would be how striking some of the lack of usage for managerial tasks is, because I would have thought that things like, like manager time usage was like, or like scheduling sort of tasks, like that's the kind of thing that I would have thought AI would be good at. And to see that it not being used for that is interesting and suggestive. Did you have any big surprises in what people are using AI for?
I think I had the same reaction as you. I mean, I had a very strong prior about how large the computer share of usage would be. I just knew it would be pretty large, for all the reasons we talked about. And then I was surprised. Office and administrative support, we can explain it ex post, but it is surprising that the jobs that we think are the most kind of mundane knowledge type work should be automated first, I would think. And that's not where the usage is. That is really interesting.
Right. Right. I guess the last thing I'll say there is maybe I thought there would be a little bit more in the artistic realm, because we always talk about AI as being really good in these domains where having like a lot of candidates options that you can sort through are good, right? That's kind of like the Avi Goldfarb machines framework. And you'd think art would be perfect for that, right? Generate 1,000 images and choose the one good one. But art is merely at 10% of 10% of usage, which is a little bit lower than I would have guessed, I think.
I mean, actually, for me, it's higher than I would have guessed. I don't
Yeah.
view Anthropic as investing heavily into artistic
Ah,
modeling.
okay. So now we get back to the selection, right? Which is
I mean,
AI
the
might not be
Dolly,
the one you go to. Yeah.
yeah, Dolly is an OpenAI model, right? The other major image generation models are also not produced by Anthropic. The major video models are not produced by Anthropic. The voice models, I mean, Anthropic must have a voice model, but, I've heard of Whisper. I've heard of some of these other ones that are not Anthropic prop. So
So is it fair to say, yeah.
for music, we have specialized players like Suno AI that seem to be in the lead, right? So if you're an artist, you might use a chatbot to ideate at a very high level, but then when it comes to making your art, you're going to go use another tool. That's kind of my.
Right, right. And yeah, to the extent that you're using a lot of AI, maybe iterating and drawing or design, you're probably not using Claude. So, but that comes back to limitation of the paper. Paper can't move our beliefs about the usage of AI overall that much if it's only showing us the Claude size.
We need the API data. We need the API economic activity index.
Exactly, exactly. Okay, so maybe close with that thought. So what would be I think we've done a pretty good job of explaining how our priors and posteriors evolved. What's the next data set we need to really answer these questions?
I mean, the dream data set is a cross-platform usage data set, I think, or one, people have been doing these kind of survey studies where, they ask people like how to use LLMs, and obviously those sorts of studies are really good at what people like report, but they're not actually measuring the use cases in a finely grained manner and like the frequency and so on. But I think like if we had a representative sample of LLM usage in a population, I think that would be really great. It'd be really great to get business users. It would be really quite good to get measures of, willingness to pay of these things. So yeah, I don't think we're going to get those data sets. I mean, it's, the reason we don't have those, in some sense, they're really, really hard to collect, right?
Right. I guess you can measure the difficulty of the task by the product that you would have gotten from doing the task, right? Or at least you can bound it with the difficulty
Yeah.
of the task.
I mean, one of the interesting things, is that OpenAI released this new benchmark that uses actual jobs on Upwork, and
Right.
whether
Okay.
the
So maybe that's
AI
where we
could
should be.
complete it.
Yeah.
I think that's not going to give you a representative sample of anything, but if we're thinking about economic impacts, I do think
Yes.
that if you
Yes.
can go end to end on a task that someone is willing to pay money for,
That's an
and
epic
not a
task.
small amount of money, that is an economic task. It's a very, Upwork is not a representative sample of tasks in the economy, obviously, but if someone is already paying for the job to be done and that gets end to end automated by an LM system, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. We should definitely read that paper and more along those lines someday soon. But maybe until then, audience will have to read economics papers on its own. Do you have any closing thoughts for our beautiful and well-informed guests and listeners?
Well, make sure to review, like, comment, subscribe to Justified Posteriors. Let us know what type of content you enjoy seeing, and we'll try to provide more of it. Or if there's any topics that you would like us to cover, we are happy to take suggestions.
Write your elected representatives and demand more Justified Posteriors content.
All right. Peace.